The unexpected encounter. Detective Sarah Chen stood at the edge of Oakwood Park, her keen eyes scanning the early morning mist that clung to the dewy grass. The cool air nipped at her cheeks, a stark contrast to the warmth of the coffee cup clutched in her hands. It was barely 6 a.m., but Sarah had been awake for hours, her mind churning over the details of her latest case. For the past 3 weeks, Sarah had been investigating the disappearance of Emily Walsh, a promising young lawyer who had vanished without a trace. The case had captured the city's attention, plastering Emily's face across every news channel and social media platform. But despite the public outcry and the pressure from her superiors, Sarah was no closer to finding answers than she had been on day one. As she took a sip of her coffee, Sarah's gaze fell upon an elderly man sitting on a nearby bench. There was something off about him, something that didn't quite fit with the early morning joggers and dog walkers that typically populated the park at this hour. His clothes were rumpled, as if he'd slept in them, and his eyes darted nervously from side to side. Sarah's instincts, honed by years on the force, kicked into high gear. She approached the man slowly, careful not to startle him. "Good morning, sir," she said, keeping her voice low and friendly. "I'm Detective Chen. Is everything all right?" The man's head snapped up, his rheumy eyes widening as they met Sarah's. For a moment, he looked like he might bolt, but then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, shuddering breath. I've been waiting for someone like you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who might believe me." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Believe you about what, sir?" The old man leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and fear. "About what I saw the night Emily Walsh disappeared." Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. She had interviewed dozens of witnesses, pored over hours of security footage, and yet no one had been able to provide any concrete information about Emily's last known whereabouts. Could this disheveled old man be the break she'd been looking for? "Why don't you tell me what you saw?" Sarah said, sliding onto the bench next to him. The man introduced himself as Frank Holloway, a retired janitor who lived in a small apartment overlooking the park. On the night of Emily's disappearance, Frank had been battling another bout of insomnia, a common occurrence since his wife's passing 2 years ago. He'd been sitting by his window, watching the few late-night stragglers in the park, when he saw something that made his blood run cold. "There was a car," Frank said, his voice quavering. "One of them big, black SUVs. It pulled up to the park entrance, and 2 men got out. They were dragging something, someone. A woman. She was fighting them, but they were too strong." Sarah leaned in, her coffee forgotten. "Can you describe these men, Frank?" Frank's eyes clouded over as he struggled to recall the details. They were big, muscular. One of them had a tattoo on his neck, looked like some kind of bird. But that's not the strange part, Detective. He paused, swallowing hard. The strange part is what happened next. According to Frank, a third man had emerged from the SUV. Unlike the others, this man wore a suit, his demeanor calm and collected. As Frank watched, frozen in horror, the suited man had approached the struggling woman and placed a hand on her forehead. To Frank's amazement, the woman had immediately gone limp, as if she'd been knocked unconscious by an invisible force. "I know it sounds crazy," Frank said, his eyes pleading with Sarah to believe him. "But I swear on my Martha's grave, that's what I saw." They loaded the woman into the car and drove off. I was too scared to call the police that night. Who'd believe an old man like me? But I haven't been able to sleep since. Every time I close my eyes, I see that poor woman's face. Sarah sat back, her mind reeling. Frank's story was fantastical, bordering on the impossible. And yet, there was something in the old man's eyes, a raw fear and desperation, that made her pause. In her years on the force, Sarah had learned to trust her gut, and right now, her gut was telling her that Frank Holloway, despite the outlandish nature of his tale, was telling the truth. "Frank," Sarah said, placing a gentle hand on the old man's trembling arm, "I believe you. and I'm going to need you to come down to the station with me to make a formal statement. Can you do that?" Relief washed over Frank's weathered features. "Yes," he nodded vigorously. "Yes, I can do that. Thank you, Detective. Thank you for listening." As Sarah helped Frank to his feet, her mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the implications of what she'd just heard. If Frank's account was true, it meant that Emily Walsh's disappearance was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was something much darker, something that hinted at organized crime, possibly even human trafficking. But there was something else nagging at the back of Sarah's mind, a detail that didn't quite fit. The suited man with the strange ability to render someone unconscious with a touch. It was like something out of a science fiction novel. Sarah had always prided herself on her rational, logical approach to detective work. She dealt in facts, evidence, not in fantastical tales of supernatural abilities. And yet, as she guided Frank towards her car, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something much larger than she had ever encountered before, something that would challenge not just her skills as a detective, but her entire understanding of the world. As they drove towards the police station, the city slowly coming to life around them, Sarah's mind was already formulating a plan. She would need to re-examine every piece of evidence, every statement, in light of this new information. She would need to dig deeper into Emily Walsh's life, her connections, her work. And most importantly, she would need to keep Frank Holloway safe. If his story was true, he was now the key witness in a case that was quickly spiraling beyond anything Sarah had ever dealt with before. Little did Sarah know that her decision to listen to Frank that morning would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change her life forever, but would also uncover a truth so shocking, so paradigm-shifting, that it would shake the very foundations of her reality. As they pulled into the parking lot of the police station, Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truths she might uncover, she was determined to see this through. For Emily Walsh, for Frank Holloway, and for her own sense of justice, Sarah Chen was ready to dive into the unknown, no matter where it might lead her. The sun was now fully risen, casting a golden glow over the city. As Sarah helped Frank out of the car, she couldn't help but feel that this new day marked the beginning of something monumental. Little did she know just how right she was. Unraveling the truth. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity for Detective Sarah Chen. Frank Holloway's statement had opened up a Pandora's box of new leads and possibilities, each more perplexing than the last. Sarah found herself working around the clock, fueled by a potent mixture of caffeine, determination, and an increasingly unsettling sense that she was on the verge of uncovering something far beyond the scope of a typical missing persons case. As she delved deeper into Emily Walsh's life, Sarah began to notice discrepancies that she had overlooked before. Emily's work as a lawyer had seemed straightforward at first glance, a rising star in a prestigious firm, handling mostly corporate cases. But now, armed with a new perspective, Sarah started to see patterns emerging. There were gaps in Emily's work history, cases that didn't quite add up, clients whose backgrounds were suspiciously vague. One name in particular kept cropping up: Nexus Industries. On the surface, it appeared to be a harmless tech company, specializing in cutting-edge research and development. But the more Sarah dug, the more she realized that Nexus was anything but harmless. Its tendrils seemed to reach into every corner of the city, from local politics to law enforcement. And Emily Walsh had been working on a case involving Nexus just before she disappeared. Sarah's investigation was not going unnoticed. As she pushed further, she began to encounter resistance from unexpected quarters. Evidence would mysteriously disappear from the evidence locker. Witnesses would suddenly become uncooperative, their eyes darting nervously as they retracted earlier statements. Even within her own department, Sarah began to feel a subtle shift. Colleagues who had once been friendly now regarded her with suspicion, conversations falling silent as she entered the room. But perhaps the most unsettling development came one rainy Tuesday afternoon, a week after her encounter with Frank in the park. Sarah was at her desk, poring over financial records she'd managed to obtain from Emily's firm, when Captain Rodriguez called her into his office. "Chen," Rodriguez said, his usually jovial face uncharacteristically serious. "I'm going to need you to hand over all your files on the Walsh case. It's being reassigned." Sarah felt as if she'd been punched in the gut. "Reassigned? But sir, I'm making progress. I have leads." "It's out of my hands, Shen." Rodriguez cut her off, not meeting her eyes. "Orders from above. The FBI is taking over the case." Sarah's mind raced. The FBI. Why would they be interested in a local missing persons case? Unless Emily's disappearance was connected to something much bigger. "Sir," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I respectfully request to stay on the case. I can work with the FBI team, share what I've uncovered." "That won't be necessary, Detective," a new voice cut in. Sarah turned to see a tall, imposing man in a crisp suit standing in the doorway. "I'm Agent Carter at FBI. We'll take it from here." There was something about Agent Carter that set Sarah's teeth on edge. Maybe it was the cold efficiency in his eyes, or the way his hand seemed to unconsciously drift towards his left forearm, as if reaching for something hidden beneath his sleeve. Whatever it was, Sarah's instincts were screaming that something was very, very wrong. But she was a professional, trained to follow the chain of command. With gritted teeth, Sarah nodded and left the office. But as she walked back to her desk, her mind was already formulating a plan. She might be off the case officially, but there was no way she was letting go of this investigation, not when she was so close to the truth. That night, after everyone else had left the precinct, Sarah snuck back in. Using the skills she'd honed over years of undercover work, she managed to copy key files and evidence before they could be taken by the FBI. It was risky, potentially career-ending if she was caught. But as she thought of Emily Walsh, of Frank Holloway's terrified eyes, of the web of corruption she was only beginning to unravel, Sarah knew she had no choice. As she drove home in the early hours of the morning, her car laden with copied files and evidence, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She took a circuitous route, doubling back several times to ensure she wasn't being followed. But even as she finally arrived home and locked her door behind her, the feeling of unease persisted. Sarah spent the next few days working tirelessly from her apartment, poring over the evidence she'd managed to salvage. She called in favors from old contacts, reached out to trusted colleagues in other departments. Slowly but surely, a picture began to emerge, and it was more terrifying than anything Sarah could have imagined. Nexus Industries wasn't just a tech company. It was a front for a shadowy organization that had been conducting illegal experiments for years. Experiments on human subjects, aimed at unlocking latent psychic abilities. The suited man Frank had seen in the park, the one who could render someone unconscious with a touch, he wasn't an anomaly, he was the result. And Emily Walsh. She had stumbled upon evidence of these experiments during her work on a seemingly routine corporate case. She had been about to blow the whistle when she was taken. As the full scope of the conspiracy began to dawn on her, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just about one missing woman anymore. This was about a fundamental threat to humanity itself. If Nexus succeeded in their goals, if they managed to create an army of individuals with superhuman abilities, the balance of power in the world would shift irrevocably. But even as Sarah grappled with the enormity of what she had uncovered, she realized she had an even more immediate problem. The more she investigated, the more she became convinced that the corruption reached far beyond Nexus. There were moles in the police department, in the FBI, possibly even higher up. She couldn't trust anyone. And worse, she was pretty sure they knew she was onto them. It started with small things, hang-up calls in the middle of the night, a sense of being followed when she left her apartment. But things escalated quickly. One morning, Sarah woke to find her apartment ransacked, her copied files missing. A warning, clear as day. But if they thought this would deter her, they had severely underestimated Detective Sarah Chen. Instead of backing down, Sarah went on the offensive. She reached out to the one person she thought she could still trust, her old partner, Mike Ramirez, now working as a private investigator. Together, Sarah and Mike began to piece together a plan. They needed hard evidence, something that would expose Nexus and their collaborators in a way that couldn't be covered up or explained away. And Sarah had an idea where to find it. Using Mike's connections in the private security world, they managed to obtain blueprints of Nexus Industries' main research facility. It was a fortress, bristling with security measures both mundane and, if Sarah's suspicions were correct, possibly superhuman. Infiltrating it would be nearly impossible. Nearly, but not quite. As they sat in Mike's cluttered office, poring over the blueprints and security schedules, Sarah felt a familiar thrill coursing through her veins. This was what she had become a detective for, to uncover the truth, to fight for justice, no matter the cost. "You know this is insane, right?" Mike said, looking up from the papers strewn across his desk. "We're talking about breaking into one of the most secure facilities in the country, run by people who apparently have honest-to-God superpowers. We'll be lucky if we just end up in prison." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I know it's risky, Mike, but think about what's at stake here. If we don't stop this, if we let Nexus continue their experiments, who knows what kind of world we'll be living in a few years from now. We have to try." Mike held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, partner. I'm in. But for the record, I still think we're crazy." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Noted. "Now, let's figure out how we're going to pull this off." As they bent their heads together, refining their plan late into the night, Sarah couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. They were up against impossible odds, facing an enemy with resources and abilities beyond their comprehension. But they had something Nexus and their allies didn't: the burning desire for justice and the willingness to risk everything to see it done. Little did Sarah know that their plan, audacious as it was, would set in motion a chain of events that would not only expose the truth about Nexus, but would also force her to confront realities about herself and the world around her that she had never imagined possible. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the grimy windows of Mike's office, Sarah stood up, stretching her cramped muscles. In just a few short hours, they justice and redemption. The night air was crisp and still as Sarah Chen and Mike Ramirez crouched in the shadows near the perimeter fence of Nexus Industries. Their hearts pounded in their chests, a mixture of adrenaline and fear coursing through their veins. They had spent weeks meticulously planning this infiltration, but now that the moment had arrived, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were woefully unprepared for what lay ahead. "Last chance to back out," Mike whispered, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. Sarah shook her head, her jaw set with determination. "Not a chance. We've come too far to turn back now." With a nod, Mike pulled out a small device, a signal jammer they had procured through one of his less-than-legal contacts. If it worked as promised, it would create a brief window in the facility's security systems, allowing them to slip inside undetected. As Mike activated the device, Sarah held her breath, watching the fence for any sign that their plan was working. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft buzz, a section of the electrified fence went dark. "Now," Sarah hissed, and they sprinted towards the opening. They made it inside the compound without incident, but Sarah knew the real challenge was yet to come. Somewhere within this labyrinth of steel and concrete was the evidence they needed, proof of Nexus's illegal experiments, their attempts to create superhuman abilities, and their connection to Emily Walsh's disappearance. As they navigated the maze-like corridors of the facility, Sarah's training kicked in. Every shadow became a potential threat, every sound a warning. They had studied the blueprints extensively, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of the place. The air itself seemed charged with an otherworldly energy, setting Sarah's nerves on edge. They were nearing the central research lab when disaster struck. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a security guard. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then, chaos erupted. The guard reached for his radio, but Mike was faster. He tackled the man, the two of them crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Sarah knew they only had seconds before the entire facility was alerted to their presence. "Go," Mike shouted as he grappled with the guard. "I'll hold him off. Get the evidence." Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, torn between helping her friend and completing their mission. But she knew Mike was right. This might be their only chance. With a final glance at Mike, Sarah sprinted down the corridor towards the lab. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of struggle fading, replaced by the wail of alarms. Their cover was blown. It was now or never. The research lab was a nightmare of blinking lights and humming machinery. Sarah's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for anything that might help their case. That's when she saw it. A bank of computers, their screens glowing with lines of code and what looked like medical data. Sarah rushed to the nearest terminal, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she attempted to access the files. Years of experience in cybercrime units paid off as she navigated through layers of security protocols. What she found made her blood run cold. The files contained detailed reports of experiments conducted on unwilling subjects. Men and women subjected to treatments that defied belief, genetic manipulation, neural rewiring, even attempts at unlocking latent psychic abilities. And there, buried in the mass of data, was a file labeled Walsh E. Abilities. And there, buried in the mass of data, was a file labeled Walsh E. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She had found it, proof of Emily's connection to Nexus, and evidence of crimes that went far beyond anything she had imagined. But before she could delve deeper, a voice cut through the air, cold and precise. "I'm impressed, Detective Chen. You've come further than anyone else who's tried to expose us." Sarah whirled around to find herself face to face with Agent Carter, the FBI agent who had taken over her case. But the badge he flashed now wasn't FBI. It bore the insignia of Nexus Industries. "You," Sarah breathed, her mind racing. "You've been part of this all along." Carter smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Part of it, my dear. I'm the one who started it all. And I'm afraid I can't let you leave with what you've discovered." He raised his hand, and Sarah felt an invisible force slam into her, sending her crashing into the bank of computers. Pain exploded through her body, but she forced herself to her feet, her eyes never leaving Carter. "You won't get away with this," she growled. Carter laughed. "But don't you see, Detective? We already have. For years, we've been shaping the future of humanity. And now, thanks to you, we'll be able to perfect our work." With mounting horror, Sarah realized what he meant. They had been counting on someone like her, someone smart enough to uncover their secrets, determined enough to chase down the truth. She and Mike hadn't been intruders. They had been the final test subjects. As Carter advanced on her, his hand outstretched, Sarah felt a strange sensation building within her. It was as if every cell in her body was vibrating, resonating with an energy she had never felt before. In that moment of clarity, Sarah understood. The experiments hadn't just been about creating superhuman abilities. They had been about unlocking the potential that existed in everyone, a potential that could be awakened under extreme stress. With a cry that was part defiance, part discovery, Sarah felt the energy within her explode outwards. Carter was thrown backwards, slamming into the wall with bone-crushing force. Panting, Sarah stared at her hands in disbelief. She had done that. Somehow, in the crucible of this moment, she had awakened something within herself. But there was no time to process this earth-shattering revelation. The facility was in chaos, alarms blaring and footsteps thundering down distant corridors. Sarah knew she had to act fast. Racing back to the computer terminal, she initiated a data transfer, copying everything she could onto a portable drive. As the progress bar crawled towards completion, Sarah's mind whirled with the implications of what had just happened. She had become the very thing Nexus had been trying to create. But unlike them, she understood the responsibility that came with such power. It wasn't something to be exploited or used for personal gain. It was a tool, like her badge and gun, to be used in service of justice. The data transfer completed just as the sound of approaching footsteps reached a crescendo. Sarah pocketed the drive and turned to face the door, her body thrumming with newfound energy. As armed guards burst into the room, Sarah Chen, detective, seeker of truth, and now something more than human, stood ready to fight for justice for Emily Walsh, and for a future where power wasn't concentrated in the hands of the few, but was the birthright of all humanity. The battle that followed would become the stuff of legend, whispered about in the shadowy corners of the world where the truth still mattered. Sarah Chen, with her newly awakened abilities and unwavering moral compass, took on the might of Nexus Industries and emerged victorious. In the days that followed, as the evidence she had gathered sent shockwaves through corridors of power around the world, Sarah grappled with her new reality. The abilities she had awakened that night in the Nexus facility were both a gift and a burden. She knew that there would be those who would fear her, those who would seek to exploit her, and those who would see her as a threat to be eliminated. But Sarah also knew that she was uniquely positioned to ensure that what happened at Nexus never happened again. With Mike by her side, injured in the fight but recovering, and more determined than ever to stand with his partner, Sarah set out to build a network of like-minded individuals. People dedicated to using their abilities, whether natural or awakened, to protect the innocent and fight for justice. As for Emily Walsh, her story didn't end in that Nexus facility. With the evidence Sarah uncovered, a massive search was launched, and Emily was found alive, held in a secret Nexus black site. Though traumatized by her ordeal, Emily's indomitable spirit shone through. She joined Sarah's cause, using her legal expertise to navigate the complex ethical and legal challenges posed by the existence of enhanced individuals. In the years that followed, Sarah Chen became a symbol of hope in a world grappling with rapid change. She was living proof that even in the face of unimaginable challenges, the human spirit could adapt, grow, and flourish. Her journey from dedicated detective to reluctant superhuman was a testament to the potential that lay within every person. The potential not just for great power, but for great responsibility and compassion. As Sarah stood on the rooftop of her city one night, looking out over the twinkling lights below, she reflected on the twisted path that had led her to this point. The world was changing, evolving in ways no one could have predicted. But as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, to fight for truth and justice no matter the cost, there was hope. And in the end, Sarah realized that's what her story had always been about. Not about superpowers or shadowy conspiracies, but about the extraordinary strength that ordinary people could find within themselves when faced with impossible odds. It was a lesson she had learned through blood, sweat, and tears, and one she would spend the rest of her life sharing with the world. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, Sarah Chen, detective, hero, human, smiled. Whatever challenges the future held, she was ready to face them. For herself, for her city, and for all those who still believed in the power of truth and justice. The end, or perhaps just the beginning.